All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about using Espresso for fast and reliable feedback, how to embed quality across the Android lifecycle, particularly using a framework, an automated UI test framework called Espresso. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and we will email out the presentation, a link to the presentation once it's completed. And any questions you have, you can use Twitter and use the hashtag JustLetMeCode, or you can use the WebEx chat panel today. And we'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, for QA at the other end of the webinar. But we also continue the conversation throughout today and tomorrow and in the future. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce myself, the person who is talking right now. My name is Paul Bruce. I'm the developer advocate / evangelist at Perfecto. And I have the luxury of doing a lot of research and helping with all sorts of kinds of projects around here, speaking to customers, speaking to people out at shows, going to shows. And so I get to see a lot of perspectives, and I also get to incorporate those into the learning that we'll be doing today. And so at Perfecto, we have a number of different frameworks supported. Obviously, there might be many people on the call who have had familiarity with Appium and Selenium. As we see now, native test frameworks are becoming popular like Espresso and XCTest. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, Espresso. We're going to be covering a quick introduction to Espresso, the testing framework. So for those of you who are very familiar with Espresso already, just hold on tight. We'll be talking, kind of putting this all into context throughout the entire webinar. But for those who don't know or who are coming from other testing frameworks, it's important to kind of get a grasp of the fundamentals. We'll be talking about the pattern itself, the Espresso pattern, and showing some code examples. And then I'm going to do a quick comparison between Espresso and Appium so that we kind of understand, moving from one paradigm to another, what to expect. Then we'll be talking about improving build verification, particularly moving tests inside the build process after the build is complete in continuous integration. And I'll touch briefly on things like testing types and schedules and how those fit. And then we'll see an example of Espresso on real devices in Jenkins itself. Then I want to touch on pros and cons of the do-it-yourself lab, because there are a number of people who think that this stuff is easy. And quite frankly, I want to help those folks, and I want to help make sure that we are truly thinking about success when it comes to doing this stuff both in continuous integration as well as in the IDE. And then we'll finalize the session by talking a little bit about accelerating the feedback loop, particularly when it comes to reporting and event-driven notifications. So I want to do a quick poll just so I kind of get a sense of who's in the room and what types of testing, UI testing technologies do you use? So we'll do that now, if you'd be so kind and actually specify which testing technologies you use. We're starting to see a couple come in. Quite a few people use Appium. Other folks are using other frameworks than this, and this actually aligns quite a bit with our experience in the field when we're speaking to lots of enterprise customers. Okay, good. So there's not a great deal of people who are currently using Espresso, but there are a few. So at around 8 or 9%, there are a few people who are using Espresso already. So I'm glad to have you on the call, just like everyone else, and I'm glad that I've structured the learning session in such a way where we're kind of introducing the concept as well. So let's get started. I want to start by introducing the Espresso test framework. So I've done this a couple times. I was out at Android and DevCon in San Francisco last year, and then out in Virginia talking about this. Basically, Espresso is an automated UI test framework for Android apps, okay? So the easiest way to get started with this is literally to go to Android Studio, go over to your Run menu, and press the Record Espresso Test. And now that'll pop up the Espresso recorder eventually, but the first thing it does is it creates folders in the right places, specifically Android Test. We'll see that in a second. And also, it adds Espresso libraries as dependencies in your Gradle file. So this basically we'll see what comes out of the recorder and why you might choose to use it or not use it, but simply by doing this, it gets you a new project set up. So it's an easy way to get started. And on the surface, Espresso is a fluent UI testing pattern. And by fluent, it means that you can write to an API and continue your conversation in code by simply just appending the next statement. So for instance, the pattern is we need to find a UI element, then we act on it, and maybe we check it afterwards. Sometimes you can simply just find it and check it. So in this case, you'll see a code example for onView in a few moments, but onView is the way to get view elements out of layouts, and then specifically on data helps us with other types of lists as well. And so as you can see, we can simply just use onView, and then we provide a matcher, and you'll see that in a second. And then we want to perform an action, and then we use check along with a couple of matchers. We'll talk about that in a second as well. Matchers to help verify that the data that we're expecting actually meets goal. So if we break down the find, the act, and the check, this is just a simple syntax reference that I use occasionally. I printed this out just for my own sanity. And if you can think about this, this deck will be provided to you after the webinar, and we'll probably provide this in a blog post shortly after as well. But the idea of this is this whole deck will be a reference that you can use. There are a number of different links in it that I encourage you to check out as well. So the find, simply just find something. We want to use with ID, and you'll see why that's so important compared to using something like XPath. And then if we want to select any of or all of, we also have these things called matchers, these Hamcrest matchers. Hamcrest is a library that is supported and by default in the support library for Android. And so this dramatically simplifies some of the work that we have to do to select elements. So no longer do we have to have 3 lines of code just to find the right elements. When you act on something, there are simplification methods, shortcut methods that help you do things like click, type text, the normal type of actions you'd expect. And then check also helps us match against both properties and potentially the contents of or text of an element. So let's actually switch over to that and see what that looks like in Android Studio. So I've just switched over to Android Studio. And what you can see right now is that I have a test up. Now I'm going to go around and describe a little bit what we're seeing here in Android Studio IDE. On the left, we have the project folder. And so this project view provides us both the source code of the application as well as the text itself. The tests themselves. So if we look sort of at the contents or the code underneath, the code that makes up the different activities or the views for the application is in one folder, but the tests, the Android Espresso tests, are in another. And so that's what I meant by basically saying go and just record a basic Espresso test. You don't even have to step through the motions too much. It'll do some of the setup work for you. If you were to use that recorder, what you get is a test that looks a little more verbose than what I'd like to suggest is a better way to go, which is to simply just learn the framework and write the tests yourself. But for the purposes of today, if we recorded, we'd get something like this. And as you can see, it does use that same fluent pattern. It just happens to put certain elements in variables so that it, as an automated syntax recorder, can sort of know what to expect. So as you can see, it kind of says on view, and it uses the IDs of the elements right off the bat. It does a little bit more like with parent, and sometimes that's not necessary. So you get what you get from an automatic recorder. It can be sometimes garbage. In fact, this test itself fails by default. So that's why I say keep it simple. you're the ones that are constructing the app or the tests, and so what you want to do is match to what you know. And speaking of what we know, one thing that just happened before we started this webinar was that in Jenkins, I've already got this all set up to automatically build, to automatically test on real devices after a build. But my build failed. And so in some cases, you might be in Android Studio on Espresso, not just writing the tests and then testing them the first time. You might actually have to go in and figure out why a test is failing. And so in this case, what I've done is I've actually gotten to that test that was failing. And one of the things I noticed right off the bat is that in this case, the application itself is a tip calculator. And my tests, the data itself is erroneous. So one of the things that happened was I put a 1 in the wrong place. And if I were to simply just correct that error, then I could actually save the file and do a quick commit back to the source code and provide that test back to the Git repo. And so when I do that, as you can see, a few things changed. If I do a commit and a push, it's going to push that back up to my temporary repository. And so once that push is complete, then of course the system itself will start to kick off another build, as you can see right on the left here. Now all of a sudden I've fixed my test, and so then it can go ahead and do what it's supposed to do. And afterwards, I'm going to get some notifications about that. So in a few minutes. So we'll continue on, but consider that the point of being able to simplify the syntax for a test is to get to the point where you understand what the test is doing easier without having to visually navigate a lot of extra syntax. And so Espresso itself does a really good job at having simplified syntax on that case. Now, if we were to actually go and do another statement like this, like if we were to say on view, and I were to say with ID, one of the things you might notice that's a bit different from, let's say, the Appium world or the WebDriver world is that it's not necessarily relying on XPath. In fact, what I've got here is a resource dictionary that has a number of ways to select elements. Now, you can think of this resource dictionary as something that is dynamically generated every time things in the app change. And so the great part about having both the app and the test code in the same project or in the same location is that you can actually benefit from the automatically generated and refreshed elements, things like identifiable resource dictionaries, in the application itself. So in this case, if I just say, hey, I'm looking for an element with a specific ID, right off the bat you can see that it's a lot easier for me to find the elements that I'm looking for. Like, for instance, if I'm looking to verify the total to pay, then I could continue on with my statement, right? And I would say, well, now I want to check that it matches. And matches comes from the Hamcrest library. It's a helper function that allows you to write these fluent syntax and make it readable. But in the meantime, it has to match an element. And if I were to say something like with text, and then provide some text, now all of a sudden we've done a lot in a very little space. And so we're not worried about XPath expressions changing or the app changing and the XPath in our tests not changing too. We're not worried about that because as soon as let's say I'm in the designer and I change the name or an element in the visual layout and I change it in such a way where it might have broken my test, now all of a sudden it reflects directly in all the tests that I'm about to break. So you get very fast feedback about what, as a developer or as a designer, which tests you just broke. Now, for the folks on the call who are straight up quality engineers, they're not part of the software development of the app code itself, consider how much easier this now is because people aren't breaking your tests all the time. And for developers who write tests, consider that this is exactly like the refactoring and the instant compile of other modules that depend on things that you might have just blown away. So this is the same, this provides you very fast feedback in that sense. So the other thing I want to specify here is that Perfecto has a plugin to be able to pull in real devices from our cloud that help you do things like actually run your test on the real device and in the environment that might be causing the issue. And so in this case, I've already actually connected up to a device. This is a Samsung Galaxy S7 Edge. And I've also connected it up using a technology we call DevTunnel. Now, we're going to be having a webinar next month specifically about DevTunnel. But suffice it to say, all it means is that I'm able to connect up to that device just like it was connected to my laptop here, like a really long USB cable. And so in this case, all I have to do is go up to the debug button in Android Studio, press the debug, and what's going to happen is that it's going to ask me what deployment target, meaning what device do I want to deploy it on. Now this usually is full of devices that, let's say you've got emulators or maybe you have a device plugged into your machine. And so in this case, what we do is we say, okay, fine, let's use the device that we just connected up to in the cloud. And if all things are going well, Gradle will finish. And you'll see these commands start to connect to the device itself. So ADB stands for Android Debug Bridge. It's essentially the client-server model that allows your, let's say, your tools like Android Studio or some other tools in the Android toolkit to be able to connect over to a device and provide things like instrumentation as you go along. I've actually got, as we're waiting for this, I've got a quick example of what that looks like. So how ADB and instrumentation work together is simply that the ADB server will interact with an ADB client on the device itself and use what's called a runner, a JUnit, an Android runner, to run both the app itself under instrumentation, but also your tests. And Android Studio allows you to actually compile, there we go, allows you to compile the app code completely separate from your test code. And this is really cool because if you're compiling release versions of your app, yet you want to still run the tests, you don't have to worry about test dependencies being accidentally included in your app itself. You can keep your app release version the exact same thing that's going to eventually go to customers and your tests outside of that. The other cool thing is that your app can run on the UI thread that it normally runs on, whereas your tests itself run on separate threads. And the instrumentation allows those tests to utilize the app and the resources of the app to verify what it's doing as it's going along. So this whole model makes it quite a bit faster than, for instance, if we were to look at the alternative with Appium, which is a slightly different model. The script itself, like a WebDriver script, an Appium script, or a Selenium script, sets up the device capabilities and then uses the wire transfer protocol to interact with the controller, the UI Automator controller on some machine, whether that's a server for you or whether it's your own machine. And then the UI Automator client interacts with the device under test. So the tests are only being sent one step at a time, if you will. And that can cause a lot of wire chatter that, quite frankly, isn't the same as Espresso. So there are pros and cons on both sides. We know a lot of people who use Appium, no question about that. We are starting to see the development teams, certainly ones who want to do sort of in between the basic unit test and a simplified UI test, that they're starting to use things like Espresso and XC test for both Android and iOS. And while the execution itself is instrumented, you also have a number of things that are different, like you use code to locate your objects as opposed to XPath. Upgrades come with the Espresso ecosystem. So when Google ships out a entirely new version of the SDKs or an API level, it also has done the work to verify that its testing model, Espresso, is up to date with that API. So you don't have any test framework doesn't match the operating system on the device problems like we might have when it comes to things like iOS 10 was a good example a couple months ago when it came out. It caused a number of different problems with Appium. And so simply by having upgrades as part of the ecosystem, making it easy for you to upgrade your code and upgrade your test suites, it saves you a lot of time there too. The stability depends on how you write it, but by default, Espresso sort of encourages you to write your tests in a less fragile way because for two reasons, and we'll get into that in a second. And then finally, the one thing I would say is, though, Espresso is not cross-platform. It is built for Android. WebDriver, on the other hand, built for cross-platform. And if you want to kind of know more about what choices you have and why you might make one choice the other way, why some tests might be cross-platform and others not, I encourage you to go to the link at the bottom of this slide, bit.ly/oss-test-choices, and that gets you to an article that one of my colleagues, Ron Kay, wrote about basically a big grid comparing all the different major test frameworks, UI test frameworks. So I encourage you to check that out. The two ways that I see Espresso improving over the standard sort of Appium approach is Espresso avoids sleep creep. And by sleep creep, what I mean is these little sleeps showing up in between steps in your scripts, in your WebDriver-based scripts. And you might ask yourself, why does that show up? And it's because of two reasons. One, you might not be using a framework that encourages you, an additional framework on top of Appium, that encourages you not to do arbitrary thread sleeps. And the other reason is that, quite frankly, it's too easy to copy and paste code. It's too easy to just stick a sleep in there because something's not working today, and then you forget it's there. And the problem with sleeps all over the place is that, guess what? When it runs in CI or when it runs on somebody else's machine, that sleep, that timeout, might be a different value. It might literally take a lot less time or a lot more time on some machines. And so in that case, it breaks on some machines but not on others. That's the first fragility, the first aspect of fragile that I would suggest as a problem. And then the other thing that Espresso avoids is, like we said before, XPath breakage, meaning if I write an XPath expression and then something in my app changes, like for instance, let's not use the text, but maybe if we use an ID, right? Again, what we see in Espresso is that when the ID changes, you see it at compile time in the IDE. However, you don't get that same benefit unless you go to extreme lengths in Appium. And so the thing about strings that I don't like is, as a developer, coming from my background as a developer, strings tell you absolutely nothing. It tells your compiler nothing. There's no refactoring support, right? The question is, can you use them properly? Of course. There's plenty of people who probably write really great XPath expressions. But I would suspect that every single person who is writing good XPath knows why they have to write good XPath, because they felt the pain of scripts that are breaking simply because there was a little bit of delta or change between the app and the script itself. So none of these statements really apply when it comes to if you're using the pattern like the r.id pattern in Espresso. And so that's the other reason why it's a little less flaky. So to summarize, there's a few other resources I would call out. And again, you can use these, you can get these links once we send out the deck today. But there's a great intro to Espresso and Spoon that, again, my colleague Ron wrote on his personal blog. There's also, I can't help but keep coming back to this Espresso tutorial anytime I'm a little confused about things like intent or about things like annotations. You know, we won't get into that too much at all today, but there's additional advanced stuff that's all covered in this Vogela blog Espresso tutorial. And if there's one person that has really impressed me in the entire Android Espresso ecosystem, it is a woman named Chuki Chan. She has spoken a number of times on YouTube about Espresso. She blows my mind every time I watch them, and I'm glad for it. So I highly encourage you to watch everything from Chuki Chan. And if you have any questions, again, if I know the answer, I'll get it right back to you. But if I don't, I'll help you find it when it comes to Espresso. Tweet me and email me, and my contact information is there as well. So now that we've talked about what it looks like in the IDE to be writing tests, to Espresso tests, and to kind of like play around with them, the next step is to say, well, what happens to these tests afterwards? And so obviously we don't write automated tests just so that we can run them manually. We write them so we can express our intentions in a way that other people can run, and more importantly, our CI process can automate. And so the next step is to talk about improving build verification in CI. So if you think about the entire pipeline, I just want to zoom out for a bit and kind of provide context here. Code, when it gets written, it gets put into a source code management system like Subversion or Git in many cases. And that code, oftentimes will trigger a build, right? We'll see that in a second. But what happens after the build, right? The build kicks off some basic validations. And many teams already do advanced unit testing and some integration testing every time a build is run. But what we see is that when you can pull your UI tests into the build post-build process, or what we call the build verification process, so long as they're not flaky, so long as they're resilient, and then also if they're run on real devices, you get a better feedback loop about what your build just did, or what it's about to do to people if you were to ship it then. So typically, there are probably many people on the call who are familiar with automated regression testing and large suites of tests that have to run on nights and weekends, because essentially a lot of the testing was left more towards the end than earlier on in the stage. And our point here is to get testing earlier and earlier so that we get faster feedback when it comes to the stuff, the code that changes, the code, and I'm including tests, because tests are a lot of code too. So the point is of this pipeline, we're driving to a go-no-go decision about whether we should deploy this, whether that happens in a matter of hours for you or whether it happens in days or weeks. The fact remains is that this whole process is just ready for feedback loops to be instilled in the right places, but those feedback loops have to include the right context, the right and complete feedback. And so this grid is a quick little conversation piece we often use with people who are talking, and we're trying to ask, what does it look like? What does your build process look like? What kind of testing are you doing across this pipeline? And so complete feedback is really the next step. Once you get some basic testing in CI, the next step is to say, well, that doesn't cover the reality, which is we have a lot of different devices in the Android world. And so what we do is we typically say, well, you might be doing quite a bit of unit testing during commit. The total time of that commit is a certain amount of time. This is not best practice. This is simply just a starting point for a conversation to say, what would you like as the total CI duration on every commit? To ask that question and to start filling in this for your own teams. Because again, this is a shared set of responsibilities, some regression tests. If you're doing those on an hourly basis, how much of the regression tests are you doing? If you're doing that nightly, we want to do nightly regression tests. You see what I mean? The point is that there's various amounts of complete feedback along the way, but in the mobile space, especially in the Android ecosystem, that requires a certain number of real devices and environments that you test on to really get complete feedback at each of these stages. And so what I'd say is if we can simplify to a recipe for both fast and complete feedback, to satisfy both of those goals, what we need is a system that has on local build, maybe you're running your unit tests and only the new UI tests that you've introduced in that commit. And you might be using like an emulator or something like that for running those tests. Again, a narrow view perspective on the reality that you might be deploying to, but again, good enough for early feedback. And because I just include API here simply because in many cases we're also in the development world having to use static APIs or mocks or virtual APIs to sort of speed up the process of testing. But then going from a commit or a check-in, a code check-in to the build process, now all of a sudden you're going to be doing integration testing and smoke testing. And that's where you really want to start using real hardware, because that's where the first early signs that your code didn't exactly do something you expected it to on platforms you don't have access to locally. And so you might be using mocks for that on your API side or mock data as well. Once you get to full and nightly stages, you want to be doing full regression. And again, some people have very large test suites. We're talking thousands of tests. And so those thousands of tests might not be able to run, certainly sequentially, overnight, or certainly a couple times a day. So we'll talk about how to fix that as well when we talk about accelerating feedback at the end. But again, you want to be using real hardware. Many of the folks on the call who are already Perfecto customers know the value of using real devices in continuous integration or through automated testing, because stuff occurs on real devices that don't occur anywhere else. So you need to be testing for that. So let's actually take a look at an example I have in Jenkins. If you remember, in my IDE, I did a commit, and that kicked off a build here. Let's see how that build fared. So 94 is still running, and one of the things we have here, if I back up a bit, is I have a couple of different jobs in Jenkins. One of the jobs, if we go into the configuration, is simply set to look at the Git repo that I've been making changes to. And so I've got my source code management, that's pointing to one of my repositories. And the build is actually doing a debug build. You might see that here. And then I'm using a custom command to a little shell script that uses our API to do parallel testing. And in fact, I want to take a look at the results here so that you can kind of see what has happened to this build. So in this case, what we're doing is, I believe this is from a while ago. Let's actually kick that off again, folks, just because I like to actually see it work. So this was a little while ago. I'm going to cancel that job. Oh, actually, just in time. One of the things that I have set up is also, once the build is complete, that we actually see in Slack that I get a notification of what happened. And because I just aborted it, because I just canceled the job, I got a notification in Slack. So that's all that happened there. So let's refresh this page in Jenkins. Now we know that that job didn't quite work as expected. So if we go back to Android Studio, I think I had connectivity issues here, and that's one of the reasons why we're having a little bit of roughness in the demo. So if I actually make a change, just a simple change, do another commit again, and push it, it's going to trigger that build. And now that it's pushed it, let's do this here. Great. Now back over in Jenkins, we should expect to see that build kick off. So as it has, what we'll do is we'll go into the log file here, and you can see that Gradle has already been starting to build the APK files for this Android application that I have. It's a simple tip calculator. And at the end, the last slide I have is if you go to perfectomobile.com and then you go under the Solutions menu and you select Developers, we've got a whole section that talks about things like how to use real devices and IDEs, how to use them in continuous integration, and walks you through this process, literally gives you the step-by-step how to do this kind of stuff yourself. So in this case, we saw that the build was successful, and now it's going to go out and use my script that uses the Perfecto API to do a couple of things, to upload the latest APK, the build, upload those to the repository in my account. Then it's actually going to look for devices that are available to use. It's going to allocate those devices, and then it's going to install the APK on those devices, run the tests, and then do this all in parallel. And so as you can see, it's kicking it off on a couple of different handsets right now, and it's running executions on each of those handsets. So let me close this out real quick, this first device here. And if I switch back over to the IDE, imagine if I'm just writing a test here, I can see that my commit actually took in a couple of different devices. So as you can see, those devices are starting to load up, and they're going to load up the app itself. They're going to see the tests run in parallel, the same set of tests run in parallel. And in this case, what I've actually done is said, let's just run a couple of the tests that are in this, this test suite, just the small tests. And so once they're done, what we see is that our test either succeeded or failed. And in this case, now we have the results in our build console log. So we can actually go check out what might have happened in those tests. If we actually click on this, open it up in a new tab, we get a nice report that basically says exactly what went on. And so in this case, we could go and actually watch what happened. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we could actually handle this manually. So for instance, if we go back up to all my Jenkins jobs, and we jump into one that uses the plugin specifically, and we actually look at the configuration for this, one of the things that you'll see is that it pulls from a Git repo, and then it's actually going to upload those files as build steps themselves, rather than using the shell script that I referenced earlier that uses the API. It's actually going to use our plugin for this, and then it's going to execute a pre-existing script in the cloud. So over in our demo cloud, this is just a demonstration cloud, I can open a script that I've created that basically does exactly a similar thing as the APIs. But if you look at some of the details of this specific type of action, it asks for what device you want to run it on, what the test application package name is. I'm going to expand this window for a second. What the tested application file is. So this is the APK that we've uploaded to the cloud, as well as the test set that we've uploaded as well. These are separate little, essentially binary packages. And there's a couple of different options here that you can both drive in Perfecto script as well as through the API, but here we are in a visual way. I can show you those extra parameters too. And there's a couple things. If you want to provide a custom JUnit runner, you can do that. There's a couple of reasons why you might do that. You can filter down to the package that the tests are in, the package name in the Espresso or in the Android project, as well as you could even just narrow down to a specific class of tests. Now I've used the size filter, and what I forgot to mention before is that each of these tests might have annotations on them that help you say in future contexts what this test might run, how it might run. And so in this test is a simple test. And so I'm going to call it small because it doesn't take very long to run. Out of the box, Espresso includes a small, medium, and large test sort of annotation matrix that allows you to do things like this. So you can note that this is going to be a small test and then only run the small tests in a certain cycle if you want to. So in this case, if we go back to the Jenkins job, what we see over here is that, again, we had a failure, we changed something, we didn't upload it properly, or we used the wrong data in this case. I personally think that I'm doing something wrong here. But in the interest of time, what I'd like to do is switch back over and kind of talk a little bit about the pros and cons of a lab setup, right? The do-it-yourself lab setup. So we've talked a bit about using emulators or real devices. And what I'd like to do is use that same grid, that same mentality when I had that simple recipe that includes local builds, merge to build in a CI server, and full and nightly regression. And if you think about it, a local build, fine. Go for it. Use the emulator. Again, we know that not everything that happens in reality can happen on an emulator, but that's fine. If you want quick and fast, dirty feedback, that's fine. The problem, though, is when you start to use a local lab for local builds, the question is, who gets which devices? And do you have a device that's available that's going to do what you want it to do? So when you start to share devices with a team, it can get a little bit finicky. Whereas a cloud lab that allows you to actually interact with these devices, you have a lot more flexibility in that way. So for local builds, you can either use the emulator or you can use real devices in a cloud and get real feedback there. Now, if we think about merging your code and actually kicking off a build, the next step, the emulator itself, becomes really problematic. And those who've actually tried this out themselves will know that emulators are flaky. If you don't reset them properly, then they run into memory issues after a certain amount of time. If you do reset them properly, the problem is you have to spin them up, and spin-up time takes a while. So this becomes really problematic to use emulators when you're talking about builds using UI tests after every build. Local lab also becomes really problematic because then again, you're sharing resources with your CI server and there becomes contention there. And oh, by the way, the local lab itself has to be highly reliable if you expect the dev team to introduce UI testing into every build. And so what we see is that cloud labs, particularly in Perfecto's case, the high reliability and scalability that we provide is the enabler to move UI tests into the build to get that fast and complete feedback. And then when it comes to full and nightly tests, of course, we're talking emulators aren't going to work. Local labs, same problem. But really, it's only a cloud lab that can help you run lots and lots of tests. So our message here is simple. What we want you to do is less hunting for devices. And we want you to do more coding, whether that's app coding for app developers or whether that's test coding for testers. Because really, you got to ask yourself, how many devices are we talking about per, let's say, developer or per tester, right? If these are all local devices on those machines. And as that sprawl occurs, is it really in sync with the market? How easy is it to keep the right set of devices across the whole fleet so that you're actually in sync with what's going on in your users market? What about spares and adapters? You got those handy? Or what about storage and hosting and power costs, right? These are some of the things that go into what it takes to really build and sustain a local lab. Forget monitoring and security, because whose job is that? Whose job is it to monitor and to make that lab secure? So even if you do overcome these challenges, the next big challenges that you have are when you start to do high volume automated testing. Now all of a sudden your lab has to be just as, if not more reliable, than your continuous integration servers. And once you do get to that point, the fact is, when you're testing, doing a lot of UI testing, that introduces the problem of big data, meaning lots of test results from those CI processes. And now you run into an issue of who manages those results. How easy is it to zoom in there? How do you collaborate on those results? Dashboards? What are we talking about there? So the fact is, if you really want to be successful in doing UI testing and getting earlier, fast, and complete feedback, what you need to think is that we want to maximize that test coverage across those devices, and we want to achieve high degree of automation, right? We want to get to from like 30% automated UI testing to like 90%, right? We want to focus on other things. We want to make this as automated and as reliable as possible, right? But we need an integrated lab that isn't just outside the dev process, but if anything, can be included and integrated into the entire life cycle. This includes both development cycles, testing cycles, and operations monitoring. And once we have those things, what we want is fast feedback that makes it easy for us to drill into the problems, to see the problems, to get those notifications, and get back to resolving the issues really fast. So that's why Perfecto, across those 4 specific considerations, that's why we do what we do. Right? We have uncompromised security. We have network operations teams and support desks that help you make sure that the problem of the lab is not a problem you have to focus on. You can focus on building awesome apps for customers. So that's what we're in the business of doing. And the way that we do that, the way that we include complete quality across that entire life cycle, is by providing a lab that you can use for coding and debugging, for functional and performance tests. You can get production insights out of this, and also you can even integrate this into things like customer support. When they need to replicate a problem before they hand it back to eventually a developer, they can truly replicate this problem in a specific environment, a specific platform. Now, we also include a couple things too, like reporting and analytics, that make it very easy for you to drill in there. And we provide a layer called Wind Tunnel that allows you to simulate real user environments and conditions like network latencies and location and screen rotation as well. So the last thing I want to mention is when we talk about accelerating the feedback loop, what do we mean? Right? What are the things that actually help us do that? So the first thing I want to say is we've got to be parallel testing, meaning we've got to be running these tests instead of sequentially across a variety of platforms. We absolutely have to be running them on a couple of platforms when we're building, and then more platforms when we're doing larger scale automated regression, right? But we have to do that in parallel because otherwise we're going to be waiting to the end of time for all of our large test suites to complete in sequence. No, we have to use parallel testing. So if you think about it, if you're doing, let's say, build verification or smoke tests as part of a post-build action, one of the things you might want to do, imagine you're doing this a couple times per day. You're getting these commits a couple times per day. And you want to do this on 4 most critical platforms. Well, when you do that in parallel, like what we saw earlier, it takes a matter of minutes rather than 20 minutes or 30 minutes for the developers to get back what just happened because of the code they changed. And then if you think about the sort of the once a day or nightly or larger scale tests, the same rule applies. You want to parallelize your tests across both the platforms, the test suites, and the conditions. So that when you're doing end-to-end testing, then it's taking the least amount of time as possible. And this parallel testing, again, requires a highly reliable and scalable lab like Perfecto provides. It also means that if you want this fast feedback, you need stuff that fits into your own workflow. And to that end, we actually just recently published a blog, which you can actually either go to blog.perfectomobile.com, or you can just go to bit.ly/perfecto-slack to get right to the article that our reporting team put together that shows how quickly fast feedback about code changes improve, how much it improves team collaboration when you can see the results of a code commit and see it on a couple of different devices. Now all of a sudden you can start to see much quicker, and then you can actually reduce the amount of time it takes to resolve issues before they get out to customers. You know, the less context switching. If I was just working on it a few minutes ago and it failed, now I don't have to wait a couple days and context switch from another workload to go back and fix that problem. I can fix it right now. That's the point, right? And to that end, we can actually drill you in to the details of a specific report. So as you're running these tests, you can get right into specific issues. This just happens to be a Selenium script, but the same thing applies like you saw before. We can drill right into the details of a report. And, of course, if we zoom back out one level from the details of a report, not only do we get sort of what's working and what's not, but the Perfecto has a new capability called digital zoom. And this is what you're seeing here, is the ability to drill from deep detail back up to high level down to deep detail, and to be able to see at this level that last week's builds were far more effective than this week. So what was it about this week's work that actually caused a lot of issues? We can actually start to use our visual and intuition as a team to look at just the build health, the build quality over time. Zooming one layer out even further up than that, being able to see the difference between the success and failure of, let's say, your smoke or your sanity tests or regression tests. You can tag these tests in different ways to help you report on this and see if the vast majority of your smoke tests are doing just fine, but it's only a few regression tests on a very specific platform. So this is digital zoom from Perfecto, and for existing Perfecto customers, I'd encourage you to reach out if you don't know about this already. Reach out to your account reps, to your success manager, and actually talk about this, ask about this level of detail. Same thing with our Espresso capabilities. If you want to try to start to work on Espresso and you've already got an account, or if you want to try that out, by all means, reach out to your account representative there. Obviously, what we're trying to do is provide a complete view of build quality, and that encompasses a number of teams, not just the developer who's fixing the problem, but maybe the person who wrote the tests, right, who's trying to figure out exactly what about the test failed, or which modules are causing the most trouble. If a manager walks in and wants to see what problems he or she are going to be having to deal with that day, right, in that morning, just get a quick overview of what the day is going to look like, what challenges already exist in the day. And the last thing that I want to say is we've covered a lot today, but again, this was supposed to be sort of an introductory and kind of provide you some context around what we do, why we're providing support for Espresso, and why you should really take a look at it, why you should introduce that. Again, many of our customers use a mix of different testing technologies and frameworks to really accomplish what they want. And again, our point is to say, hey, this is a great framework. So we've done an introduction, we've done some code samples, we've taken a look at what Espresso versus Appium, what the differences are there, and we've seen how we can improve build verification in our continuous integration process with Espresso on real devices through Jenkins. Again, not just Jenkins. If you've got Team City or if you've got Team Foundation Server, similar rules apply. It's just a little bit different configuration is all. And so when it comes to what we've got, you can actually see this if you go over to perfectomobile.com, and if you move over to the Solutions tab, there's a section specifically for developers and for QA. But much of this, Espresso especially, is a developer-focused framework. So it doesn't mean that I would encourage everybody on the call to try it out, not just developers. But this is where we're starting to see developers taking a little bit of the responsibility over UI testing. So if you go over to that section, you'll see a whole list of things that we can help you with from a development mindset. So at this point, what I want to do is just open it up for QA, and I'll actually, if you don't mind, one of our other colleagues here, I'm just going to borrow her computer real quick to see if there's any questions. Okay, so the first question I actually want to say, I want to address is it possible to use Espresso for apps built on Xamarin? So Xamarin is a hybrid framework, for those who don't know, and the hybrid framework actually builds out native artifacts. So it would build out an APK for your Android framework. I am not familiar with whether it actually works. I've heard of one or two people trying it, but again, I think this is a great question for follow-up. I'm going to do a little bit of research on this myself, and then if you're on Twitter, by all means, follow me or look at the hashtag JustLetMeCode, and I'll be posting an update shortly after this call, early this afternoon. The other thing is, another question from Daniel is, what's your opinion about using UI Automator with Espresso? Is it good practice? So UI Automator, the short answer is it depends, I'm sorry to say. So this is where the framework came from originally. Quite frankly, I haven't, in my experience with Espresso, I haven't had to utilize UI Automator yet. The idea of Espresso is to provide very clear, simple, discrete UI tests. It's not supposed to be an end-to-end testing framework. So some of the functionalities you get from UI Automator might actually not really apply from a paradigm perspective. If you think about the paradigm of Espresso, it's really opinionated about trying to keep things simple and straightforward. I mentioned something earlier called intents. And one of the ways that you can mock out things like camera interactions for local testing, for local UI testing, you'd use intents to do that. So maybe in a later webinar or a couple of blog posts, I can provide a little bit of information there. If you have specific situations where you want to use UI Automator, I would really, and this is specifically for Daniel, but anybody else who uses UI Automator, I would encourage you to reach out and provide me a little bit of context about what you're using UI Automator for, why you're thinking about that approach, and that'll help to figure out if that's the best thing for you. There's one other question. Well, yeah, there's a question, is this included with our Perfecto account? The Espresso support certainly is. It's just another type of step that you would include, so if you want to do that in a Perfecto script, you can. Also, some of the stuff that I showed earlier included a shell script that interacted directly with the REST API that every private cloud has. So if you have a private cloud, if you're a customer, then what you'll need to do is work with your system administrator to get the permission to do automation if you don't already have that already. And that will give you the ability to utilize the REST API if you want to send direct commands there. Again, if you go to this developers section of our website, one of the flows that we provide, one of the specific things that we talk about is how to use Espresso in Jenkins, and there's a full tutorial, step-by-step tutorial that includes some source code. It includes certainly the shell script that I referenced today, and so you're more than welcome to check that out. So there's one or two more questions I'd like to handle offline, but once again today, I really appreciate your time. And any questions you have, please send them along our way. This is how we know how to build the things that help you succeed. So I greatly appreciate your time, and yeah, congratulations. We've just done the Espresso introduction and talked about CI. So cheers, folks.